Today we're going to talk about how objects with charge get that charge. There's two main categories that we can classify how we charge objects into. One is called conduction, and the other is called induction. Conduction will usually involve, not always, but it will usually involve contact. We remember the difference between conduction and induction sometimes by that prefix there. Conduction, contact. It doesn't always involve contact. When lightning strikes, that doesn't involve contact between the cloud and the ground, and that's still conduction. But usually, when we have this transfer of charge that results in conduction, it involves contact. Now, conduction usually involves contact. Conduction always involves a charge transfer. When lightning strikes, electrons are transferred from the cloud to the ground or from the ground to the cloud. That's a charge transfer. Whether they're touching or not, we still call that conduction. When I walk across the carpet with my leather-soled shoes and I touch somebody in the finger, okay, electrons will transfer from me to the other person. Okay, that's called charging by conduction because it's a transfer of charge. Usually, I've touched that person in order to transfer that charge, but occasionally I may get close and the electrons jump from my finger to that person's finger before we've actually made contact. It usually involves contact, but it always involves a transfer of charge. By the way, what kind of charge is always transferring? Negative. It's the negative charge. It's always the electrons that are transferring charge. Now, induction never involves contact. If you walk across the carpet, and you shock somebody, that's charging. It's charging by conduction because I've touched that person. And when you've touched that person, it can't be induction because induction never involves contact. Induction also never involves a charge transfer. Now I'm going to star that. The reason I'm going to star that is because there seems to be an exception to that. Not really, but there seems to be an exception to that that we'll talk about here in a few minutes, just so that you understand that there is no charge transfer, but it just appears as if there is in certain circumstances. Now, we're going to break induction down into a couple of subcategories. First one we call a temporary separation of charge, and the second one is called a permanent charge. So we can temporarily do it, or we can do it for good. I'm going to draw a couple pictures to help us to understand this, to help illustrate this. The first one is going to be of a neutral object. I draw it as if it has 4 positive and 4 negative, but it could be 4 million protons and 4 million electrons, as long as it's neutral. And remember, again, a negatively charged object nearby that neutral object. This negatively charged object, of course, contains electrons and protons, but we're just labeling the electrons because we're just trying to show that it's negatively charged. There's more electrons and protons in there. Now, if I bring it close enough, then the electrons might actually arc or jump, discharge to the other one. That's actually called charging by conduction because charges have transferred. That's not what I'm trying to illustrate here. So let's assume that in this case, this object isn't close enough for electrons to jump, or the air isn't moist enough for the electrons to jump, or whatever. Okay? The electrons aren't jumping. It's not conduction taking place. The electrons aren't transferring. What happens? Well, let's ask what happens to two different things. Specifically, what happens to the protons in this neutral object? This object on the left that's neutral. What happens to the protons in there as a result of these electrons? They want to be pushed over, right? They want to be attracted to this negatively charged object. But they don't go there. They don't go anywhere, in fact. How come?
Because they can't leave.
Because they can't leave, right? They're stuck in the nucleus, and they're not going anywhere. As much as they want to be attracted to the right-hand side, they don't end up going there. What happens to these negatives, though? They're not as tightly bound, right? Something can happen to the negatives. Where do they go as a result of this negatively charged object that's being brought nearby? Go to the left. Now, I'm drawing it as if all of them go to the left. That doesn't happen. Some of them would go to the left. I'm just kind of simplifying it by showing all of them going to the left. In the end, whether it's all of them or some of them, we get the same effect. And that is that one side has a net negative charge, and one side ends up having a net positive charge. This is what we call a separation of charge. When one side is negative, one side is positive. The overall object is still neutral, but one side is negative and one side is positive. Now, there's one more word with that, temporary. Why do you think we call that a temporary separation of charge? Yep. Good. When you take this away, when this thing disappears, pull it away for whatever reason, right? Those electrons are going to go more or less back to where they came from. So it's a separation as long as we keep the object doing the charging nearby. As soon as we take it away, the phenomenon disappears. Okay, let's draw another picture now, down below. This time we have a neutral object, as we did last time. But that neutral object is brought near a positively charged object this time. What happens to the protons in that neutral object? One word. Nope. What happens to the protons in the neutral object? Simple one-word answer. Nothing. Nothing happens to them because they're stuck in the nucleus. They're not going to go anywhere, right? What happens to the electrons? They can go somewhere because they're not as tightly bound. Where are they going to go? Left, right? They're going to go to the right. They're going to be attracted to this positively charged object. Not all of them are going to go to the right-hand side, but we're going to get enough of them to the right-hand side that we end up with one side that is overall positive and the other side that is overall negative. Once again, we have a separation of charge that's temporary, as Parker said, because when we take the thing that's doing the charging away, when we take this thing or this thing away, they just go back to the way they were before, and that separation is gone. Look, in both cases, the object is still neutral, but there's a charge that's created on each side of that neutral object. Now, I want to remind you of something that we talked about a little bit earlier today, and we also talked about yesterday. That third law of the electric charge that said charged objects attract neutral objects. Protons don't attract neutrons electrically, but positive attracts neutral objects. Why? Look at the side of the neutral object that is closest to the charging object. In the diagram on the top, the side that's closest is positive, the object is negative. The side that's closest down here is negative, the object is positive. Why do charged objects attract neutral objects? Because negative attracts positive, and because positive attracts negative. Really, you need a separation of charge for that to happen, and you can't get a separation of charge in something like a neutron. That's why you need an object with protons and electrons to create a separation of charge rather than just a neutral particle, right? Okay, good. We've taken care of the temporary separation of charge. Last thing that I want to do here. How do we make it permanent? How do we make an overall charge on one of these neutral objects that remains more or less indefinitely? I'm going to draw these pictures again just to reduce a little clutter on them. Here's my negative object brought near a neutral object. And here's my positive object that's brought near a neutral object. What I want to do is introduce what we call a ground wire. Now, a ground wire could be literally a wire that goes into the ground. You have one of those in your house. There's a wire that goes from your circuit breaker panel. Oftentimes it's just an exposed copper wire, maybe the thickness of your baby finger, that goes through the wall, down the outside basement wall of your house, into the ground. Sometimes it's not even covered on the outside of your house. Sometimes you can actually see the bare copper wire on the outside of the house. It goes into the ground, it's anchored there so it doesn't get pulled out, and it's just a source and sink of electrons. So in other words, when there's a short circuit in your house, there's excess electrons, these electrons go through this ground wire into the earth. That's it. They prevent fires from taking place in your house, they prevent electrocution from taking place in your house. It's not always a wire that goes into the ground. It could be something literally touching the ground, or it could be something literally touching something that's just really, really big that can act as the ground, that will allow electrons to go from it or to it. Whatever it is, this is the symbol for a ground wire. It's a little line like this with the little lines at the end of it. It doesn't matter where we put the ground wire, we're going to get the same effect. What happens here? Well, we said a minute ago that these electrons at the top diagram, get pushed away to the left-hand side. But with a ground wire there, what happens? Well, they don't stop at the border there. They keep going down into the ground. What does that leave our object that was neutral? Now it's positive, but it's not permanent yet, because if I take this away, what's going to happen to these electrons? They're just going to go right back where they came from, more or less. So before I take that away, what do I got to do? Take away the ground wire, cut the ground wire, remove the connection between this object and the ground. When I do that, hey, the electrons want to go back up when I take this away, but they have no path to get back up. So now we've got a permanent positive charge. If we brought a negative object nearby, we charged it positive permanently by attaching a ground wire. Again, it doesn't matter where I attach the ground wire. In fact, on the second diagram, let's attach the ground wire over here. In the absence of that ground wire, actually, you know what? Let's put it in a different place altogether here. In the absence of that ground wire, these electrons want to get pulled over to the right-hand side. But now we've got a ground wire there. What do they do now? Go down? They get pushed down? Wait a second, they can't get pushed because they're attracted to that. Everybody have an idea what happens here? The Earth is not just an infinite sink of electrons where we can keep pouring the electrons down as long as we want, like in the top diagram. The Earth is also an infinite source of electrons down here as well. We can also get as many electrons as we want from the Earth. What happens is this ground wire allows the electrons to come up from the Earth into this object, charging the object. Now it's negative, yeah. But it's not permanent yet, because if I take this away, what's going to happen to them? They're just going to go back, for the most part at least. So how do I make it permanent before I take that away? Cut the ground wire, remove the connection between the ground, the Earth, and this object. Then I can do whatever I want to this. These electrons may want to go back down into the Earth, but they have no path, no way to get down there.